Okay, I know I don't normally make videos like this, but honestly I miss it, and the X-Men 97 Season 2 trailer leaked online. So, let's talk about it. So who's this group of mutants at the very beginning of the trailer? Well, the first one is Monet St. Croix. She's the one who's red and looks like she's kind of a demon. Monet St. Croix has two forms. There's her human form, then there's her penance form. That red version that you see is her penance form. Her story in Marvel is convoluted as hell, but I do have a video on her. I'll post that playlist down below that covers all kinds of mutants in Marvel Comics. In her normal human form, she is incredibly powerful. Telepathy, flight, telekinesis. She has regenerative healing factor, super strength, speed, durability, super reflexes. She can learn at an accelerated rate. This girl is a heavy hitter. In her penance form, she's immune to telepathy. Her form is technically Red Diamond, and she's also got really sharp claws. Moving on, the next kid here, that looks like Prodigy, a kid by the name of David Aliane, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Anyway, Prodigy is a mutant that has the ability to absorb all the knowledge and skills of anybody within his immediate vicinity, which technically makes him a super genius. The downside is that as soon as that person leaves his immediate vicinity, he loses access to all that information. But even on a physical level, he's very akin to Taskmaster in the sense that when he's in a physical fight, he can actually predict what that person is going to do. The next one is an obvious one for anybody who is a Marvel Comics fan. This is Quentin Quire. Quentin Quire is one of the most powerful telepaths in all of Marvel Comics, mostly because of the fact that he took a drug called Kick. But that shirt that he's wearing that shows the Phoenix symbol, that's a reference to Grant Morrison's Here Comes Tomorrow, the idea that he will become a host for the Phoenix Force at some point in time. Suffice it to say, out of all the people who are here, he's certainly the most powerful one. Now, the kid who's wearing the blue shirt with the yellow undershirt, there's all kinds of theories about him. Some people think he's Cypher, Douglas Ramsey, who has the ability to understand any language in existence. That's probably true, but the yellow shirt also gives me reason to believe he might be Elixir. Why? Because the yellow shirt just seems a little too on the nose, and Elixir in Marvel Comics is a gold character. The powers of Joshua Foley are essentially biokinesis. As an Omega-level mutant, he can control the biological structure of himself or anybody else. This usually makes him an Omega-level healer, but he can also do things like manipulate the life force of others. And there's also the idea that he could potentially bring people back from the dead. Now, he's done it on a limited scale. There was an instance in Marvel Comics, in Uncanny X-Men Volume 4, Annual Number 1 from 2016, when he tried to resurrect all the dead mutants on Krakoa. He wasn't able to do it, but he almost did. And so that was an indicator of just how powerful he could become. After this, there's the girl in the orange hat, and there are a lot of theories of who this girl is. For example, there's a lot of people out there who believe that she's Idea Conquo. I don't really know if that's the case. The reason why is because her character has the ability to manipulate temperature, both hot and cold. There's nothing here that indicates that's what she's doing. Another example is Tempo. She has the ability to manipulate time. Then there's Joanna Cargill. That was my initial thought. Joanna Cargill is a character known as Frenzy. Frenzy's dope. She has super strength and super speed, that kind of stuff. She has super durability, which basically puts her on par with Luke Cage. Another really big theory here is that she's Celia Reyes. Celia Reyes actually appeared in Marvel Comics in a story called Operation Zero Tolerance. A lot of you guys will probably remember that because that was the major plot point for X-Men 97 Season 1. The problem with this is that Celia Reyes is an adult in Marvel Comics at the time that she's introduced. More so than that, she has the ability to create force fields. The reason why I say I don't really think it's Celia Reyes is because when you look at the trailer and how it opens, this girl is running alongside everybody else, but she's controlling a kind of bird that emits light. And as soon as I saw that and realized that's what was going on, my mind immediately jumped to Obax, the character of Lightbright, who quite literally manipulates light. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. We'll have to wait until the show comes out, but that's my best guess on who that is among all these young mutants. Having said that, I have seen a lot of theories circulating around out there that Season 2 is continuing two major stories from X-Men the Animated Series, that the first one is One Man's Worth, and the second is Beyond Good and Evil. One Man's Worth was a 2-episode story that showed what what the world would look like if Professor Xavier had died before he could ever form the X-Men. This basically led to a world where mutants were hated and feared by humanity and were essentially caught up in a perpetual and permanent war against humanity. So no peaceful coexistence on any level was ever worked for because there was no Professor Xavier. Magneto led the resistance, which wasn't really even the X-Men proper. It was just whatever mutants hadn't been destroyed. And all of this is due to the fact that Trevor Fitzroy and Bantam had gone from the future into the past and killed Xavier. Now that whole thing is stopped and the present day goes back to what it was supposed to be, as opposed to this horrific future where mutants are hunted everywhere. But Beyond Good and Evil was actually a story that revolved around the character of Apocalypse. And the whole idea behind it is he was just seeking absolute power, kidnapping the most powerful telepaths across the Marvel Universe. A lot of what you're seeing here seems to hit at that, just because of the fact that Apocalypse was manipulating time. And I think a lot of people are using that storyline because of what we end up seeing in the trailer, showing a future where Apocalypse dominates everything. I don't think that's what's happening at all. What I think's going on over the course of the season is that it's a combination of two stories. The first one is the Rise of Apocalypse storyline from Terry Kavanagh back in 1996. The second one is basically the Earth 4935 universe, which is the future that Cable comes from. And here's what I mean. So looking at the X-Men in the past, the trailer doesn't really give us a lot of context here, right? We do get to see that we're in the era of Rama-Tut because we quite literally see him standing there. And we also know that this is the era of Rama-Tut because at the end of season 1, Magneto and Xavier and Rogue and all those guys were transported into the past before Apocalypse rose to power. Now, for those of you guys who don't know about this story, what Terry Kavanagh did was provide a whole origin for Apocalypse where we didn't have one before. Well, we don't have to go into all the details of it because honestly, I've covered it, so I'll post a link to that as well down in the description. It was effectively a modification of why Rama-Tut became Rama-Tut. For those of you guys who don't know the relationship between Kang the Conqueror and Rama-Tut, the only thing you really need to understand here is that Kang the Conqueror initially started as a guy named Nathaniel Richards who came from a reality where humanity never experienced the Dark Ages. The result was that humanity was technologically advanced and you had what was essentially a utopia. Growing bored with everything, he discovered a time machine which took him into the past of the main Marvel Universe, Earth 616. The result of this is that he christened himself Rama-Tut and then ruled as Pharaoh of Egypt. What Terry Kavanagh did in the Rise of Apocalypse storyline is he added in the origin of Apocalypse in saying that one of the reasons Kang had traveled back and operated as Rama-Tut is because he knew the level of power that Apocalypse would attain at some point in time, and he wanted to make Apocalypse his heir. So he was effectively just waiting for Apocalypse to emerge because he arrived earlier than he intended to. The Fantastic Four end up showing up based on some other mission. They fight Rama-Tut, and he's forced to flee before he can make Apocalypse into his heir. The result is that Apocalypse goes forward as essentially a demigod and starts forcing societies to wage war against each other and all kinds of crazy stuff. This, in X-Men 97 Season 2, this is taking place in the past at the time that Kang the Conqueror is operating as Rama-Tut. Now, we don't know how far-reaching this is going to be. We don't know if this season is adapting the Terry Kavanagh story or if it's just showing that Rama-Tut is operating at that point in time. And that's it. But as far as the one man's worth concept goes, I think a lot of people are drawing on this because there is a point in this trailer where it shows Magneto's beard grown out. That's what happened with him in the One Man's Worth 2-part episode in the original X-Men the Animated Series TV show. The difference here is that this is just because Magneto's been here for a long time. They weren't just thrown into the past, other individuals were thrown into the future, specifically Cyclops and Jean Grey. What's being adapted here is the Earth 4935 storyline. So as a little bit of an explanation here, and bear with me because it's kind of important to understand Cable. So as a lot of you guys probably know, in Marvel Comics, you've got Jean Grey and you've got Madeline Pryor, and Madeline Pryor is the clone of Jean Grey. Well, Madeline came along after Jean Grey basically died at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga in Marvel Comics. The original intention of Chris Claremont was to have Madeline Pryor and Cyclops effectively ride off into the sunset, just living out a life in Anchorage, Alaska, never to be seen or heard from again. again. Such as it was, Jean Grey was so popular that Marvel brought her back. And so what Chris Claremont did is he wrote this story where we ended up finding out that Mr. Sinister had cloned Jean, and that's where you got Madeline. And so prior to Jean Grey's return, Cyclops and Madeline Pryor had Nathan. That's who goes on to become Cable. But eventually, Jean Grey returns. So after Nathan's born, Cyclops abandons Madeline and Nathan because Cyclops is a dick. And then he rejoins X-Factor and fights on this team alongside Jean. But in the midst of all of this, the villain Apocalypse discovers through Mr. Sinister the existence of Nathan and realizes how powerful he's going to become. And so Apocalypse kidnaps Nathan and then infects him with a techno-organic virus. The idea being that if Nathan can survive the virus, then he is qualified, quote unquote, to be the new host of Apocalypse, because this was at a time in Marvel Comics when Apocalypse had to jump bodies because his powers were so extreme, they would burn out whatever body he was currently occupying. This leads to Cyclops alongside all of X-Factor, as well as the Inhumans, for reasons that I'll never fully understand, jumping into a conflict and trying to save Nathan from Apocalypse. And while all that's happening, a portal opens up and a woman basically appears telling Cyclops and Jean that she can save Nathan potentially in the future. And so they have to let this woman take their son. Now, eventually, Marvel comes back around in 1994 with a story called The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, which was written by Scott Lobdell. This is where Jean and Cyclops go into the future to raise Cable. And that looks like that's what's happening right now. Because in that future that Cable was taken to, which actually turns out the older woman was Rachel Summers. If you don't know what that means, not a great big huge deal. But in that future, Apocalypse rules everything. The reason why this is referred to as Earth 4935 is because in Marvel Comics, outside of Marvel 2099, any and all futures are possible. And so Earth 4935 is just any one of the futures that exist out there. And in that instance, it's a future where Apocalypse rises to power and basically takes over the world. And that's what you're seeing in this episode. When you see that teenage kid that's got the strip along his hair, that's Cable. Right? It's literally just Cyclops and Jean raising their son in the future. But this will most likely bring in the character of Stryfe. Now, whether or not we're going to see Stryfe as a major player in this season or in the next season, I have no clue. But for those of you guys who don't know who Stryfe is, when Cable was taken to the future and there was an attempt to find a cure, there was also the possibility that they couldn't cure him. And so in the future, they cloned Nathan, because if he died of the techno-organic virus, then they could just raise the clone because he would be astronomically powerful. Apocalypse in this future, Earth 4935, where he ruled everything, discovered this, and he saw it as a second chance to kidnap Nathan. And so he sends his forces, but he accidentally kidnaps the clone, believing that it's Nathan. And so he raises the clone as his own. That clone goes on to become Stryfe. But again, I might be jumping the gun here because of the fact that there's no guarantee that his character is going to show up. What I think would be really cool is if it turned out that the kid that Cyclops and Jean were raising in the future actually turned out to be Stryfe. Because that happened in Marvel Comics. Not exactly like that, but Stryfe came from the future into the present day, pretended to be Cable, and then launched an attack against the X-Men. It was pretty dope. It was a story called Executioner Song. But beyond this, there is the shot of Cable who's just standing there in the midst of all these explosions and this great big huge firefight. There's a couple of possibilities there. The first one is that it's just showing us what this landscape looks like. Nothing more, nothing less. The other possibility is that this is the end of the season, and that's what feeds into the nature of Stryfe, because in this future, Apocalypse is eventually defeated and destroyed. And when that happens, a war breaks out between Cable's Ascani clan and Stryfe's New Canaanites, and they're literally warring against one another in order to figure out who is going to take over the world, for lack of a better word. Cable wants to save the world, Stryfe wants to rule it and become the new Apocalypse. And that's kind of the origin of the vendetta between the two. Honestly, this scene could go either way. But beyond that, we get to see Polaris. And I know a lot of fans are very excited about this. Polaris is the unsung hero of the Magneto family line, the second daughter that nobody ever talks about. She basically has powers that are identical to her father, but Polaris is a hoss. One of the other cool things though is that in this particular scene, if you go forward a couple frames, you get to see Jonathan Starsmore, Chamber. So Chamber is a mutant that is literally made of energy. The reason why he has that glowing triangle on his chest is because when his powers first manifested, it literally blew his chest apart along with his lower jaw. So he was just kind of emanating energy for years from this part of his body within Marvel. There was one point where he wore a kind of device over himself that would keep his energy from escaping, but he's wildly powerful, just being able to emit these incredibly powerful blasts. There's also another character that we get to see for a split second. Maybe it's Ink. I'm not 100% sure. It's the guy with the mark on his face, but it's really difficult to tell just because of the quality of the trailer and the fact that the show's not out yet, so we don't really have any context. But after this, we get to see X-Factor. Now, X-Factor is a really dope team within Marvel Comics, but it's important to know this is the second iteration of the team. Calling back to that conversation that we had a little bit ago about Madeline Pryor and Cyclops and the original X-Factor, the original X-Factor team was basically a reforming of the original X-Men team. Iceman, Beast, Angel, Cyclops, and Jean. Eventually, that team disbands, and in the face of it, Valerie Cooper forms X-Factor. Now in X-Factor Volume 1, issue number 71, what we end up finding out is that the X-Factor team under Valerie Cooper is the spiritual successor to Freedom Force. Freedom Force was a group put together that was effectively Mystique and her Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. So if you remember these guys from X-Men the Animated Series, Mystique, Pyro, Avalanche, and Blob, well, they go back a ways in Marvel. They were Mystique's Brotherhood, and then they became Freedom Force. The idea is that they would work on behalf of Valerie Cooper and the Commission on Superhuman Activities in exchange for pardons for their crimes. Eventually, Freedom Force disbands, but because of the struggling nature of the relationship between humans and mutants, the second iteration of X-Factor is created by Valerie Cooper to bridge that gap, to instill some measure of trust. That's explained in X-Factor issue number 71. Alex Summers, the brother of Cyclops, doesn't want to join. It's actually Professor Xavier that seemingly convinces him to. Now, the team as it's composed in this moment only has 4 members. We're actually missing both Polaris as well as Alex Summers, but the team that you see here is Strong Guy, whose name is Guido, Wolfsbane, who's Rain Sinclair, Multiple Man Jamie Madrox, and Siren, the daughter of Banshee, Sean Cassidy. Strong Guy is exactly what he sounds like. He's a guy who's really, really strong. Rain Sinclair technically has lycanthropy, but she's not actually a werewolf. It's simply just that her mutant power allows her to take on all the attributes of a werewolf. But unlike traditional werewolves, she's not really bound as far as her transformations go when it comes to the full moon. She can turn full werewolf, she can stay in her human form, she can kind of operate as a blend between a werewolf and a human, which is actually what she did for quite some time in Marvel Comics. And then Siren essentially has the powers of her father, emitting what's called the Banshee Scream, which allows her to fly or can even be used as an offensive attack against various people. But following this, we go into what's the last scene of the trailer, which is Weapons Plus. And this one is actually the most interesting out of all of it because there are big modifications being made to the whole Weapons Plus program from Marvel Comics and even from the original X-Men the Animated Series. So of the list of names that we can see, there's a handful that I want to point out here. The first one is Ajax, Francis Fanny. Now, some of you guys may remember Ajax from the Deadpool film, and in Marvel Comics, he was essentially the strong guy. He's the guy who enforced the rule, for lack of a better word, of Dr. Kilbrew at what was called the Workshop. In Marvel Comics, a lot of you guys may be aware of Weapons Plus. According to Grant Morrison, it all started with Captain America, the attempt to create super soldiers. Captain America was frozen in a block of ice, and so after that, it went to Weapon 2, 3, 4, all the way up to Weapon X, also known as Weapon 10, which is how you get Wolverine. But whenever there was an experiment as part of the Weapons Plus program, and that experiment was deemed a failure, they were sent to the workshop of Dr. Kilbrew, where he would basically experiment on them and torment them. Deadpool, Wade Wilson, was considered a failed attempt at Weapons Plus. They tried to give him Wolverine's healing factor, it didn't seem to work, so they sent him to the workshop. When he encounters Mistress Death, his healing factor kicks in, and it's actually way more advanced than Wolverine's, and he's been operating as a crazy mercenary ever since. But for Ajax himself, he was modified by Dr. Kilbrew, but I don't necessarily know that I would describe him as a product of Weapons Plus. But after this, you have Aurora. This is Jean Marie. She's the sister of North Star, who operates as part of Alpha Flight. She's had varying states of just mental insanity over the years, but she was also experimented on by Weapons Plus. Her ability, which is not a byproduct of Weapons Plus, but it is an ability she has nonetheless, is actually light projection. After this, you have Phantom X. He's known as Weapon 8. He's basically an artificially evolved person that's got 3 brains in his head. His central nervous system actually comes in a physical form known as Eva, so you could make a credible argument in saying that he's half man, half machine, specifically because his mother procreated with a robot. But it all really just kind of comes down to how it was that he was engineered. He was one of the more exotic experiments that came out of Weapons Plus. Truth to tell, we should make a video covering the history of his character because he's a lot more complex than we have time to talk about here. But after this, you have Cyborg. Now, Cyborg is a guy named Aldo Ferro, and in Wolverine issues 62 through 64, but specifically in issue number 63, what we end up learning is that when it came to all the false memories that were placed in the mind of Wolverine alongside everybody else who was part of the Weapon X project, this was all done by Aldo Ferro because of the fact that he has the ability to tap into people's minds. And so he was essentially instrumental in giving them all their false memories. After this, you have the Winter Soldier. This is probably one of the biggest changes. There's never been an instance, as far as I'm aware, in the history of Marvel Comics when Winter Soldier has in any capacity been a byproduct of Weapons Plus. He was always just the byproduct of the Soviet Union trying to create their own version of Weapons Plus. But then after this, you have Garrison Kane. Now, Garrison Kane is a really cool character in Marvel Comics, but as far as the Weapons Plus enhancements go, all they did was just give him metal arms. Now, they do give him super strength and things along those lines, but the fact is, there are some changes here, which really begs the question, is this really a database of Weapons Plus experiments, or is there something else going on? But following Garrison Kane, you do get Weapon 6, and Weapon 6 is very easy to overlook if you don't know what it is. Weapon 6 is Project Power, also known as Luke Cage. So it's one of the cool elements of what they're doing in X-Men 97 Season 2. Now, how far deep that goes, again, I don't necessarily know. There's big changes here, which leads me to believe that either they're taking a lot of these characters who historically have never been part of Weapons Plus and just consolidating all their history down into one very simple and easy to digest concept, or this is a giant catalog of everyone out there that has superpowers and has, in some capacity, either been experimented on by Weapons Plus or monitored by Weapons Plus. But whatever the case happens to be, all this information's here, so I'm kind of curious to see where they go with it. But that's kind of my perception on everything with the trailer. I'm sure there's probably a few things that I missed here and there. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. We will have an indie comic later on today, and I will catch you all later. Peace.